What is very difficult to deal with is the big picture of what I call the other reality, the invisible world, that with which we interact without really knowing. We're sitting on a 1,000 feet, 400 meter granite needle that comes out of the Lake of Geneva and connects directly to a vortex. We're actually sitting inside of the vortex. It's the psychic that gives rise to the physical. That's the part that scientists have yet to actually figure out and be able to explain in formulas. There are going to be several events. I think one in 2009, another one in 2011. I mean, people have a tendency of just telling me whatever, whether they're ETs, luminous beings, normal people. They just tell me their stuff, and I was listening. So my whole purpose now is more showing people what to do about the years ahead.
We're here with Michael St. Clair, and he's written a wonderful new book called Zen of the Stars. Tell me about your book.
Well, the book is a product of about 10, 12 years of research. Initially, there were 4 books, 1,600 pages. I cut them all down over the years and summarized it, condensed it. The book deals with the origin of mankind, our cosmology, where I think we came from, our most probable futures on this planet, and it deals with many aspects of how we're going to go through the next 40, 50 years. So Zen of Stars is the story basically of a time portal and of the Master of the Light, who is a sort of a light being, and we're here in the castle, Chillon Castle by the Lake of Geneva, which is where the novel, the book, actually begins and ends in several dimensions. Now, to summarize the book is next to impossible. I think ultimately it has light encoded in the words, and it does something to the people who read it. It's a consciousness that changes as you go through the 400 or 500 pages. And in essence, it is a condensation of 4 books. One book was pure astrology, hardcore astrology aspects, discussion of history compared to alignments, very dry and complex. Another book was more about the future itself, about earth changes, about what's going to happen in politics, diplomacy, society, economics, science, and so on. And another book was more about extraterrestrial interaction with humanity. And all of the 3 parts were too complex for a normal reader. So people who had looked at it had asked me to simplify it and make it so that anyone could understand it. Because the difficulty of the book is I deal with the big picture. What is very difficult to deal with is the big picture of what I call the other reality, the invisible world, that with which we interact without really knowing. So I don't know if it was intentional or not. The result is that readers tell me that something in their life or in their consciousness almost changes when they read it at least a second time.
I know you've been studying astrology for many, many years and the occult, and that you basically had a background before you ever began writing this. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the formal background is simple. I went to college here in Switzerland. I studied law. I was an army officer. I spent some time in the army. I studied also political sciences, and then I worked for a few clients and left to live in Florida. But I had studied astrology pretty much seriously since I was about 12 or 14. I remember that by age 20, 21, I was suddenly fluent enough to explain alignments and to actually practice it, but I didn't until I was 32. After I had left what I would call the real world, the life of law, business, and the boring stuff, that's when I got into the more, you would call it occult stuff, but occult just means hidden, and what is hidden will be science tomorrow. When I say tomorrow, it actually already is. Things that we're talking about, different dimensions, can today be explained in terms of quantum physics and science. Dean Radin, or he wrote Entangled Minds, or Russell Moon, who wrote about the vortex theory. These are things that today we have to be able to talk just matter of fact. Like the elven world, the world of the elves, it's real, it's right around us here. You can actually touch into it and feel it. So these are things that people would normally call occult, like the Lord of the Rings, but it's a reality. And you can't really study it, you have to live in it. The astrology part is easy to study, that's relatively linear thinking. But the things I talk and write about are about the psychic mind, about the non-linear mind. And what I basically say in my, not teachings, but in what I explain to people and in my book is that we're coming into a time now where the linear mind is going to switch off, not like a light switch, but dim down and fade out, whereas the psychic mind is going to come up. And in that transition, that's when the things we're talking about will become very easy to understand. But for now, most people are functioning in a linear way, and they cannot really understand what the psychic mind is about. However, the overall worldwide psychic mind is coming up.
Can you tell us a little bit about where we're actually shooting this? Because this is a very mystical, interesting place. We're here in Montreux, Switzerland, and in a marvelous castle. And this castle factors in your work.
Yes, we're actually sitting on the granite needle. We're sitting on a 1,000 feet, 400-meter granite needle that comes out of the Lake of Geneva and connects directly to a vortex. We're actually sitting inside of the vortex. It's now near sunset time. So you have a very quiet energy. We can maybe feel it, although we're working here. This is a place that probably was settled in human history by the Celts in about 600-700 BC. Sorry, 600-700 of our time. I mean about 1,400 years ago.
Okay.
But the other reality is more likely that this place had existed on top of the granite needle for maybe as much as 4,000 or 5,000 years. We just don't know. The traces are very old. The formal history begins around the 11th, 12th century. So as far as linear mind is concerned, this is a Templar castle. This is a typical Templar place with art by the Italian and English masters from the 12th and 13th century. It was then rebuilt and built over it many, many times up to the 17th century, when pretty much the French handed it over to the Swiss. And Chillon Castle became very well known through Lord Byron, because he came here. I think friends of his started working on the novel Frankenstein, and he wrote the famous poem or little story called The Prisoner of Chillon. That's why the place actually got known.
What made you leave the contemporary world in the everyday sense and become something of an occult master, for lack of a better term?
Yes, I see what you mean. I really was that since I was a kid. As funny as it sounds, ever since I can remember 6, 7 years of age, when I was actually here for the first time that I can really remember, I knew what was going on in what I call the elven world, that other world that I describe in the book as linear as I can. But afterwards, the rest of what you call this real life, oddly enough, I remember very little. Like I said, I studied law. I went to a college. I studied law at University of Zurich. I studied political sciences. I mean, I could have been a diplomat or general. I went to the army. I served 2 years here. I was doing what any officer does here, field intelligence or commanding little companies, assisting a general. That wasn't really a big deal. What was interesting was I had a few colleagues, friends older than me, who saw that I was interested in history and slightly different topics, and they themselves were a little into this, astrology, nothing particular, but this was enough of a start, of a study group to begin talking about these things and studying them. Here in Switzerland we have a very long tradition of these things. This is a Celtic place where the Celts are ultimately native people, just like the native shamans are in America, like the native Indians or like the Aborigines almost. So these are people who are used to living free and living with nature. And so what you call the occult is to us not occult at all. It's just science. It's studying stars, alignments. It's other people who made something occult out of it.
Sure.
Okay, to finish off, after the studies, after working, I worked for a bank. And yes, during the bank days, I saw transactions, I saw the economy. So I understand what's going on in the real world. And then
what
through
were you
friends,
doing for the bank?
I was setting up trusts. I was doing mergers and acquisitions, international transactions that showed me what was going on in politics.
Can you say the name of the bank that you worked for? Is that
Yes, I worked for ABN AMRO, for a Dutch bank. And they have a very old tradition from the merchant days, going back hundreds of years. We were doing relatively normal transactions. Anyways, through what I was